All right, in this video, we are going to talk about the principles of graphic design. There is a link on the resources further down the list here that just allows you to play with this. It's a pretty cool little application that a cool guy named Andrew Mundy developed. And at one time, he had it free to download, but it appears that's not true anymore. So I'm feeling fortunate I got a copy of it when I did. It basically covers the principles of graphic design as you would expect, and we will refer to some of these as we discuss those specific topics. And so the link is there and you can play with it on your own. But we're going to talk about color theory, okay? So color is essentially, it's a crazy place. It has, 16.7 million colors that we can play with, and it's, we've got hues and chroma and saturation, and we have so many different ways of playing with color that it goes on and on. We could easily spend a full semester in a four-year school, and indeed some schools even have 2 full semesters of color theory. So we're going to spend 2 weeks, and I'm going to try and teach you as quickly as I can, some of the color theory elements that you can immediately put to use in your designs. So we got the qualities of color, right? So essentially what happens here is that color is part of the electromagnetic spectrum, and I get into this in the book quite a bit, of which the very far end of it is inducting heat, and on the other end of it is gamma rays, and it actually goes on beyond these two ends of the range, but we just don't have the equipment to measure it. So anyway, this is probably an infinite scale. So we see light coming into a situation, and then we see a color. And what ends up happening is that the color that we see is the wavelength of the color that is reflected from the surface, and everything else is absorbed. Okay. So we've got the Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon prism splitting color. This is why we have things like rainbows and so on. So this is basically what the range of color looks like. And then what happens is, of course, we have the hue, which is the color. And so we've got everything red, yellow, blue, green, so on. We have the saturation, which is the amount of the color. So basically, when you have a color, any color, and you begin to pull the saturation, or also known as chroma, as you start pulling out the chroma, it gradually goes to a gray. And then we have lightness and darkness, which means, of course, is that a very, very dark red and a very, very light red would fall into the pink and the magenta ranges, okay? So that's essentially what we have when we're working with color, basically pretty infinite, all right? So we have the inherent qualities of color. This is what I was just talking about. We have our purest red, for example. Could be any color, right? We have this cool little thing here. But in our red here, we got pure red. And we have everything that goes from red to black, and all of the range of the darker reds here. And then we have everything that goes from red all the way to white, and all the very light bits of saturation in there. So, we got the pinks and the light reds and so on. And so as we start to think about the different values of that color, here's our black to white, but we can see that we have different saturations going all the way up. I personally think that the color picker in Photoshop has the best color box. This is okay, but it gives us just all the way red down the one corner, where it really ought to be a red in the upper corner. And anyway, another story for another day. But where am I going here? Okay, so you can play around with these different colors and what that value scale looks like. But when you're playing with your color chords, this is what you have. So if you have a color, you have all of these possibilities. Okay, it's not just red. Okay, so then we've got emotive qualities, and of course we understand that emotion is a very powerful part of our goal as a designer, is to create an emotive response. And so some colors give us different emotive responses, right? So those are some of the things that you might think about as you start playing around with your color. Okay, so now we've got the color models. Okay, and again, I get in the book, I get into the color chords, color models. And so what we have here are two essentially different color models. One is an additive color model, which is the RGB model that we as graphic designers live in. It's our monitors, it's our data projectors, it's all that stuff. So the RGB, as you add color, you get more and more value until you reach white. Okay. In a subtractive color model, which is the CMYK model, which is what we use in print, so any offset lithography and in many printers, even though they ask you for an RGB color model, often that's not the best option. And the printers themselves are actually CMYK. And what happens is this is what's known as subtractive. As you start to add color, you get darker and darker and darker until you end up with a muddy, muddy dark gray. And there is no way to reach actual black with those three colors. And so you end up having to add black to get a pure black. Okay, that's a quick little story there. And again, I talk quite a bit about that in the book, so you can definitely check that out a little bit more. Okay, that's it for that little button. Okay, here we've got our color chords. All right, so basically we have our primary colors, and what you're seeing here now is different than what we just saw in this. These are color models, and they essentially sort of ignored the one that we worked with when we were all in grade school, which is this one. We see that our primary colors are red, blue, and yellow. Whereas in the RGB, they're red, green, and blue, of course, and then the CMYK. So this is really the color model. This is really the color model that that's used in the color chords, okay? And so what happens is that if we have two color primaries, they create what's known as secondary colors, okay? So those secondary colors are orange and green and purple. And the tertiary colors are what happens when you combine a primary and a secondary and you get a tertiary, which are these intercolors, okay? So we also have warm colors and we have cool colors. And here's where we start getting into the color harmony, the color chords. So analogous is one of our color models, okay? Our color chords, I should say. So analogous is three colors that are next to each other on the color wheel. They're adjacent, okay? So that could be these three, it could be these three, it doesn't matter. Any three colors adjacent to each other, okay? Then we have complementary. So complementary, of course, is any two colors that are exactly opposite on the color wheel, okay? Then we have then we have split complement. This is one of the triads. And so again, as I get into color chords, I don't want you to muck about with the actual geometry of these chords. Leave the geometry alone and you'll be fine, even though the tools allow you to muck about with them a bit. Okay. Incongruous are any two colors that are not necessarily part of a model. So an incongruous color could be red and this secondary color here as well. So here's another triad. This is a first triad, right? It's a triangle. This is an equilateral triangle. And again, these are separated by 60 degrees, so don't muck about with that. And again, you spin those around and they create different triads. So then we have tetrads. This is a perfect square, and this is a split complement tetrad. Okay, and so these are the ones that we are going to be working with. So that's one, one tetrad, the second tetrad, one triad, the other triad. Okay. So then we have achromatic colors, which don't have any chroma in them. They're basically values of black, white, and gray. And then we have monochrome. And this is important, and I actually encourage you to start with the monochrome palettes first, because they will encourage you to study the variations in a given hue. So when you start seeing that you've got, all these possibilities with one color, that opens up your eyes to the possibilities of the subtleties of color. Okay, so on the dark side, if we add black, if we start with a color and we add black, we end up with what's known as the shades. They're the darker colors. Okay, if we have a color and we go to white, these are what's known as tint. And tones are considered in the middle, and gray is, if you were to take all of the chroma out of a color, we end up with a neutral gray. All right, so those are our color harmonies. And then at the end, let's see, did I miss something? Oh, there we go. Okay, gotcha. Let me go back to this. Color contrasts are based on color dimensions, hue, saturation, and value. Okay, hue, the color, saturation, how much of the color, and value, the relative lightness or darkness. Okay, so we have what's known as simultaneous contrast, and this is where the subjectivity of color starts coming into play. What happens is that a color can be influenced by the colors that are around it. And that's very important to understand as we begin to work with real design, like what color is the type and what color is it on, or what color is an image and what color is around it. So it's very important to understand that color is subjective. It's based on the amount of light. It's based on the kind of light. It's based on how hot you have your monitor set. So there's all these variables, okay? So noticing that if we just take a look at this little value gradation creates a gradation in the red, makes it look darker over here and lighter over here, even though we know it's not. In saturation, the same kind of thing. It creates almost a vibrating boundary at this end, and then on this end, it's quite a bit quieter because the saturation of the background color creates a different color vibration or a different color interaction between those two. And then in hue, notice that we can create another effect by having a gradient that starts at the color and goes to white. And so this is exact, that's not an exact opposite, I'm sorry. So this is a different way of thinking about how color can work. Notice how it feels lighter over here and it looks like it gradually gets darker over here. So then you can kind of play around with these other different colors and see these different effects. So it's kind of fun to sort of play with that and then just go, oh, wow, look at that. Like, cool right there, right? Look how green this looks, right? Compared with this, which is quite yellow, and this almost dies because of the gradient that's on top of it. So it's kind of fun. Explore that. Same thing happens here. This is when I was talking about the colors being affected by the color that is around it, and you'll notice that the middle colors are all exactly the same, but the colors that surround them are different, creating different effects in terms of how that color looks. So this is just, again, it's an experimental thing, and if we were in a four-year school, we would be doing a lot of experiments. These are based off of Joseph Albers' color experiments back in the Bauhaus. And it's fun to explore that on your own. And indeed you can. You just make a rectangle in Illustrator and then you put another rectangle inside of it, put a color in there, and see how many ways you can make that color look different. Okay? So that's kind of fun. So that pretty much takes care of all of our simple color theories. So I hope that sort of opened up the door a little bit, and read the book for way more information on color. Okay? Cool.